Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Dolores Tarver. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Georgia, and it is time for the TT Time with Dr. Tarver. It's a wellness-based podcast. It is not intended to be a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health provider. Welcome to the last week in Mental Health Awareness May. The series this month has been entitled Maximizing My Mental. We've discussed finding your people, which are the positive impacts of healthy relationships on mental health, being mentally free from expectations placed on ourselves, and by others, life and death in the tongue, the power of words, and how we can use our words to hurt people. Last week, we got into patterns of complacency and comfort that lead us to not have the types of meaningful and joyful lives we desire because we get stuck. And this week, we're going to talk about another area of stuckness, and that is survivor's guilt. So, yesterday, we honored our fallen soldiers on Memorial Day, people who have given the ultimate sacrifice in service. It is a good time for everyone to reflect on our military who died due to conditions they developed during their time of service, who died by suicide, or who died on the battlefield. Memorial Day can be a difficult time for veterans and surviving family members. And I think it is also a time of just reflection for all of us that have lost people in this journey of life. And so that's what led to the topic today as we're discussing It Should Have Been Me, survivor's guilt. So what is survivor's guilt? The DSM-5, and that is the current manual that we use to be able to diagnose mental illnesses. The DSM-5 classifies survivor's guilt as a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Many of you are probably aware of PTSD. You've heard it probably a lot during the pandemic, in particular, as we were viewing images, very disheartening images, whether it was people being killed by police officers, if it has been in relation to war, if it has been in relation to gang activity on your local news station. So we've kind of been inundated with traumatic images over the past few years. But PTSD typically results from a traumatic event. Now, for everyone, it could be a different effect, but symptoms usually include re-experiencing the trauma. So that could be through flashbacks, might be nightmares, intrusive memories, maybe unwanted thoughts or beliefs that creep in, which become our core beliefs that develop around the trauma. We'll talk a little bit about that later. It could be anxiety, hypervigilance, which is the checking behaviors, hyperarousal, and so we're easily overstimulated. Triggered is a word you'll hear people use all the time. As a result of being triggered, as a result of having these intrusive memories, then people often will have significant mood changes, and it can make it very difficult for them to be able to engage in relationships with people. In fact, you'll see sometimes people are just avoidant, whether they're avoidant of situations, places that remind them of trauma, or even people. And then there's also the somatic or physiological symptoms that come as a result of trauma, which can be pain, headaches, GI issues, chronic illnesses that can develop as a result of, as we've talked before previously, when your body is in that constant state of arousal where you're emitting a hormone, a stress hormone, then that places you at greater risk to be able to have health issues. So there are a lot of things that can cause PTSD, and I know a lot of times we talk about combat, war, terrorism, but there are accidents. You can be in a car accident that can give you symptoms of PTSD, or it could be an accident at work where maybe you had a fall or you were injured by machinery at work. It could be injuries through sports activity, or you could be out in your yard and twist your ankle and end up having some damage because you fell to the ground. Hip fractures, natural disasters, so fires and floods fall in that category, tornadoes, hurricanes. When people bully, that can be traumatic. Violence in general, whether it's gang violence or physical abuse or sexual abuse, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, as we refer to it. It could be death of someone else. Be health problems can be very traumatic, especially if they're ongoing, chronic, severe health problems. Being separated from people that you love and care about, isolated, and also just significant losses in our lives, right? So we may have the loss of physical abilities, we may have the loss of income, may have the loss of housing, food stability. All of these things can be traumatic. And so there isn't, when we say, well, you shouldn't have PTSD, we don't get to determine whether someone has PTSD or not. It is based on whether they meet the criteria, hearing all of those symptoms and potential exposures. One might argue, how do most people not have PTSD? But I digress. So within this category of post-traumatic stress disorder, there are these different types. And so I want to talk a little bit about those before I go into survivor's guilt. So we all have stressful events happen in our lives for which we will have a normal stress response. Fight, flight, freeze is activated. Once the threat is over, our bodies return to the pre-arousal levels, as we call them. There aren't any significant long-term effects because we didn't stay in this chronic stress pattern. We were able to problem solve, make adjustments, and recover, right? So that could be an illness, learning about an illness, learning about breast cancer. You go through the treatment and you end up being in a different place. It could be an accident, a car accident that you're in, or your bike might crash into something. And so you attend to that situation, you're stressed in that moment, all of the things that come along with having to file reports and insurance claims and all of those things. But that does end, and then we're back to the pre-stress levels. Right? It might be a stressful social situation. You may be in a situation where there's an argument, or you may be in a situation where you're at a restaurant and somebody gets into it with someone else, right? So these are things that are stressful to us, but they elicit the type of stress response that is typical in our bodies for when we experience something that may be overwhelming in the moment, may catch us off guard, may make us uncomfortable, may make us not feel safe. We're able to adjust, and then we go back essentially to how we were prior to the event. Then there's acute stress disorder. Now, this can occur up to 3 days after, through a month after an actual traumatic event occurred. And you'll frequently hear people complaining about, well, if that was traumatic for them, they would have shown some symptoms. Not all the time. Sometimes we don't realize that something is traumatic, particularly if we have normalized or been dismissive of some of the things that happen in our lives. And acute stress disorder can occur if you yourself experience a traumatic event, if you've witnessed a traumatic event, somebody was talking to you about a traumatic event, somebody that you love in particular and care about, or just hearing repeated details about an event, as we see when there are often shootings at schools or, well, everywhere now, gas stations, restaurants, faith-based institutions, right? And so just hearing those details over and over again, and that's why you'll often see warnings before you open a video or read information about the potential for trauma. And what we recognize is that when it's an acute stress disorder, if we can intervene early with therapy, then a person is much more likely not to develop long-term significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And typically, they will return back to self within right under a year, or less than that. But you won't usually see those symptoms if it's an acute stress disorder persist past a year. If we see them persist past a year, then we get into another type of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So then let's get into the actual different categories that use the terminology post-traumatic stress disorder in their titles. One is dissociative PTSD. And I know some of you have heard about dissociation. Maybe you've seen, if you are a Batman fan, you know about Harvey Dent and Two-Face. And so sometimes we won't remember these other aspects of trauma that have happened in our life. Maybe they're just too uncomfortable for us. And so what happens is there's a disconnection between what we thought, felt, experienced. And so it's protective in nature because it stops us from having to deal with pain. But what happens is sometimes those memories will come back over time if they get triggered. But when we're dissociated, there might be the amnesia piece where we forget particular details or how a trauma was responded to, what our reaction was, what everybody else was doing at the time. Or we can have what we call a dissociative fugue, in which we'll end up places and not really know how we got there. And so people will often say, I'm not sure how I made it home, or I'm not sure how I made it to the hospital, or how I made it to my friend's house. I don't remember driving. I don't remember anything after, a certain point. And again, like, it is very painful, particularly when you talk about in childhood trauma, where children don't really have a full grasp and understanding of these things that are happening to them. It is not uncommon for them to lose memories of things that happen in childhood, and they're trying to piece things back together as they get to be adults, and maybe they're having some flashes of images. Um, this particular type of PTSD, the dissociative type, is more common in people who have symptoms of re-experiencing, so flashbacks. People who will find those little moments where things will come back. You may not have a clear, accurate picture. It may be a sound, it may be a smell, it may be an image, but that makes sense, right? Because you dissociated. Now, the information is still in the brain, but it's not necessarily stored in a way that we can as easily access it. But there's always a key. Sometimes we just have to figure out what that key is. So we know that for this type of PTSD, therapy absolutely is going to be a good option there. But, there's different types of therapy. So there's cognitive processing, where we're kind of trying to understand the trauma, right? Which is, a lot of people think when you have trauma, you don't want to actually relive it and re-examine it and address those thoughts and feelings. But that's actually what helps. Exposure therapy, in fact, is a form of therapy in which you are continuing to relive and be re-exposed to till you get to a point where your body doesn't react to it in the same way. You don't have those same levels of hyperarousal, but also being able to work on the thoughts that fuel the behaviors. We talked about initially some of the thoughts that come out of trauma, and some of those are negative things about, I deserved it, or I'm unworthy, or I'm unlovable. My body is not my own. I'm not safe. People aren't safe. I can't trust anyone. It may be things like, it's difficult for me to drive because I constantly think I'm going to get in an accident, or I'm constantly worried about people around me dying or them getting in accidents, right? So it can fuel these anxious thoughts too. And we do know that sometimes eye movements can help. There are a lot of different options. And for acute stress disorder, I think I mentioned therapy in that, but even for normal stress responses, like, it's good for us to talk about things, work through things, understand things. That allows us typically not to feed or allow to grow our trauma response, right? Because when we avoid, we tend to actually have more significant trauma responses and more significant symptoms. We have uncomplicated post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that we have all the symptoms of PTSD, but there aren't any other coexisting mental health disorders going on. So there's no substance use disorder, depression, bipolar, anxiety disorders. And typically, this is the most common type of post-traumatic stress disorder. And response to therapy is fairly favorable if people will get in, get going, do the work, be uncomfortable, because their trauma work is uncomfortable. Then we typically see a good prognosis. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is one we're seeing kind of present itself more frequently, which is where there have been multiple traumas, right? So there isn't just one. They may have occurred simultaneously, consecutively, over months, over years. They frequently include a combination of childhood neglect or abuse, sexual trauma, domestic violence. And so what we've realized is when we experience trauma early on in life, it primes us for more trauma. And so we're seeing a lot of people who have complex PTSD that may not necessarily recognize it as such, because, again, they've normalized abusive relationships, not being able to trust people, constantly being on guard and on edge, seeing a wide variety of emotional displays, frequently including agitation and anger. Right? And so because they become accustomed to that, and maybe that's what they grew up seeing as well, they don't even realize that they're experiencing PTSD at all. And then if you grow up in backgrounds where other people have been traumatized, we tend to, particularly in families, normalize trauma too. But complex PTSD has a significant impact not only on people's relationships and their behavior, but also their physical health and functioning. And it typically takes longer to treat, hence the complex part, right? Because it's entrenched. Now I've got to go back and look at thoughts and behaviors that I may have engaged in for decades at this point, and trying to unravel and unpack that and challenge some of those things can be incredibly challenging for people. Then we have comorbid post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that occurs when there is an additional psychological disorder present with the PTSD. So yes, the substance abuse disorder or the anxiety disorder, panic disorder, major depressive disorder are there. And we will typically see that with people who are survivors of combat PTSD, or people who have natural disasters, people who have a significant history of neglect and abuse, domestic violence, a variety of things. Like you will typically see an anxiety disorder will be present, a major depressive disorder will be present. And because we like to numb painful things, a substance use disorder, right? A lot of people will self-medicate with marijuana, or they'll self-medicate with alcohol. And regardless of your feelings about cannabis and maybe even some of the other hallucinogens with regard to being able to treat certain illnesses, what we realize is that people are using them as coping. And so they're using them to mask and not deal with, as opposed to microdosing. So I won't get into all of that here. But let's get into the nature at hand. So survivor's guilt is one of the cognitive symptoms that occurs following a trauma. And typically what happens is people will blame themselves for the trauma or feel guilty about the fact that they're still alive when someone else didn't make it. If it's a combat related loss, it may be, hey, I should have been there with my battle buddy. If I had been there, this wouldn't have happened. If I had been in charge, if I hadn't gotten hurt, if I hadn't gotten an earlier flight out, then I would have been there. Or perhaps you were back on another duty assignment and everyone else in your unit went. And so they all didn't make it back and you're the only one. And so then people are looking at you like, how is it that you're the only one that survived? Why didn't you die like everyone else? And so not only do I have to deal with my own internal guilt, now I'm feeling this pressure from other people about like, why are you the only one to come back? Like, did you do something? Did you set people up? And so it can be a lot of challenges when it comes to us and our understanding of death, because what we want to do is we want to be able to put a blame on something. We think that'll help us get control over a situation if we're able to say, hey, this person is responsible for this. Like we think that'll in some ways help us in our grieving. It doesn't, but that doesn't stop us from naturally going there. Like it is absolutely a part of us to blame ourselves, and then who else can I blame? That can take some of this pressure off of me. But as we talk about blaming ourselves, it might be somebody that we love that was in a domestic violence situation, and perhaps they had come to us for the 25th time and we're like, you're not trying to leave that situation, you're not serious about it, I don't want to keep hearing about this over and over again. And then they end up getting killed, and we think, what could I have done different in that situation? Could I have said something different? Could I have tried one more time to get them to go to a shelter? And so we'll blame ourselves for that outcome. Maybe it was a young person, unfortunately we've seen so much of this, who was at a party, who was over at someone's house, who was going to pick up their brothers, right? And they end up being killed. And we say, like, I shouldn't have sent them to do that. I shouldn't have allowed them to go to that party. I shouldn't have allowed them to drive by themselves. I should have had them stay in. Maybe it was a mistaken identity. Somebody was in the wrong place, wrong time. They were getting gas. They were at a light. And someone killed them because they thought they were someone else. And so we think, well, if I would have been with them, if they wouldn't have been in that car that night, there might be, unfortunately, we've seen people engage in theft, and then that theft results in a death. And so you come to the house to steal. I didn't expect the person to be there, or maybe I did expect them to be there, but I didn't expect them to see me, or I didn't think it through, or maybe I did think it through. And so then there's death that results in this theft, and we think, well, if they had been armed, or if I had been over there, if I put cameras up, maybe it was everyone in my family but me. And it's like, why am I still here and everyone else in my family is gone? Same thing for a car accident. It could be a tragic car accident where a lot of the family members were in the car, but one person didn't happen to be in the car. It's like my whole family is gone. Why am I still here? I should have been in the car with them. Or perhaps you were in a car crash that resulted in fatality. It might have been slippery conditions outside, a car skid, ran into you, which led to all these other cars crashing into each other, and someone died. And so now I feel responsible, even though it was of no fault of my own. I wasn't doing anything reckless. I didn't do anything dangerous. I wasn't texting and driving. I wasn't under the influence. But here I am in this accident, and as a part of this accident, someone dies. And I think a lot of times we think to ourselves, like, why they had a family? Why did it happen to them and not me? They were so young. I should have protected them. And so there are a lot of things that, cognition wise, that we think about when it comes to unexplained, well, not necessarily unexplained. Sometimes with suicide, that's the one I think that feels more unexplained. So when we lose a loved one to suicide and we don't really know, like, how did you even get to this point? Why didn't you come talk to me? What was going on in your life that you felt like you didn't have an option? And so we have a lot of questions with that. That one feels more unexplained. I think the other ones, even though we know the cause of the death, it's still we have all these questions about everything that happened before, what happened during, and we think a lot about what our loved one was experiencing. And survivor's guilt has become known as the burden of living when your loved ones have died. So here I am, left with all of these thoughts, all of these questions, all of these what ifs, and this person has transitioned. And so, in one way, I think to myself, like, hey, I'm here, I'm safe, I'm thankful that I still have a life. But then on the other hand, I feel really guilty and ashamed for still being here. I feel responsible. And so now I'm carrying around all of these very difficult, hard emotions. I feel disconnected sometimes, hopeless, worthless. I feel like I failed. I'm longing for this person that's gone, or longing for some understanding, and I can't get this. And so it feels as if we're in this place of limbo, and we're trapped. And so it can definitely be a period of challenge for people as they vacillate between these pits of despair and then relief at the same time. So what happens is, like, our pattern of thinking gets to a point where it's so distorted, that we completely overestimate our responsibility, and we assess that no one else had any responsibility, and that includes a person who may have in fact done something that led to their death. So maybe it was an accidental overdose, but you were using drugs, right? And so you may not have intended to die, but we also know that you were doing something that was risky. And so I didn't force you to use the drugs, but then I feel like I should have been responsible for the fact that you were using them and accidentally overdosed. Or, I'm not responsible for whatever chronic mental illness or physical ailments that you had, but I feel responsible that you were at a place in your life where you couldn't find a purpose to live, and that I should have done more, right? And then we become like compelled, or there's a compulsion, to we become obsessed to get this control back. And so our thoughts become this tool by which we try to get this control. So maybe I'm more strict. I'm thinking about people like, oh, you need to call me when you're out. Let me know you're back in. Let me know where you're going. We need to all be connected on these apps, because in my mind, like, if I control all of these things, then you'll be safe. And it gets to a point where we become suffocating sometimes to other people because of our constant need to be reassured that they're okay. Or maybe we feel like, okay, from this point on, I'm going to make all of these sacrifices, even to the point of my detriment. I'm going to be there for people so no one ever feels in their lives like they don't have anyone. And so now we're not being healthy ourselves because we feel like we all have this control over someone else, and what they're struggling with. I'm never going to let this happen again, not on my watch. And, unfortunately, because we're in this space of I had this bond with this person that I really loved and cared about, and I'm dealing with the loss of them. And coupled with maybe I want some retribution because again we like to find a person to blame, to be responsible because that helps us feel like we have more control. And I think on some level it helps ease some of the other symptoms we're experiencing with regard to grief. So it keeps us in that anger place. So I don't have to be in the despair and the sadness of that this person isn't coming back. Sometimes we just feel like we got to go back to that place where we lost this person in order to feel reconnected to them. And so we often will stay stuck in it, stay stuck in that pain, stay stuck in this not this place of lack of forgiveness. I think forgiveness of them, and even for us if we held some responsibility, and not because we're responsible for someone else in their decisions, but I think sometimes we feel responsible for things that we didn't say, and the stuff that was left undone. And that's where we often will confuse that with blame and responsibility for things that happen and choices people made. So how to get unstuck? I think it's really important that we understand our thoughts and our feelings, right? So we can be clear about what it is that we're struggling with and can get the appropriate support. So maybe I was in that accident that led to someone's death. And again, it wasn't anything that I did that was reckless. I wasn't on my phone. I wasn't under the influence, but someone still lost their life. And so I got to work that out and sort that out with myself and forgive myself and be able to grieve this loss and this person's loss and recognize that there are people who are mourning this person's death that may see me as culpable, even though this was an unfortunate accident, right? So I have to be able to reconcile that. So it's going to be important for me to know where I can get that support from. And it may be that I have a support group that I'm able to join. It may be that I have a combat buddy that was also a part of this unit and we can talk through things. Maybe it's people who lost children due to violence or families who lost a child. Maybe it's families who lost a loved one due to accidental drug overdose. Maybe it's people that have lost someone due to them completing suicide. But as I kind of understand what the dynamics are that I'm struggling with, then I can get that support system in place that is going to be most helpful to me, whether that's group and therapy, individual therapy, or one or the other. I definitely think it's important for us to be in a space with other people who are hurting or people that understand our hurt so we can talk through these cognitions and challenge them what's really accurate about my beliefs that I have. Because sometimes, and this is the hard part, and this is why it's important for us to grieve. Grief doesn't have time limits, but I have to be in this pain. I have to be in this place, fully deal with my sadness and discomfort, or else I'm going to get obsessed with other things. I'm going to go on these quests, but I'm not ever going to really deal with my pain. And this is part of us recognizing our limitations too. I may not ever get answers to all of the questions that I have. I may not ever be able to tell this person the things that I didn't get a chance to tell them. But I'm going to have to forgive myself and I'm going to have to forgive them if I'm going to be able to move forward. And this is the reality of our limitations. There are so many things in life that we didn't cause, we can't cure, and we can't control. And that is particularly with regard to other people. And so being able to understand that I cannot be responsible for stuff that wasn't my responsibility, right? I love you, person, and I want the best for you, but that doesn't mean that I'm responsible for every decision you made or every consequence and outcome based on those decisions and those choices. But I may be really upset with you about that you did things that put you in a situation where you ended up dead, right? And so I've got to heal from that, because sometimes I don't get a chance to determine for you where you will get your healing from. I may have a sincere prayer for you to be delivered from substance abuse, but I don't get to determine on what side you're delivered. You may not be here with me. Depending on your faith beliefs, it may be on the other side when you are with the Creator. And so that's the challenge for us in our grieving. And that's why it's important for us to get that therapy support. It may be spiritual and religious support that we need in order to be able to understand that you didn't leave me because you didn't love me. You didn't put yourself in situations to be harmed, to punish me. Your death wasn't a punishment to me, and neither was your death a punishment necessarily for you. Like sometimes we just don't know that death is around the corner. We can live our lives in all these healthy ways, still be in an accident, still be a victim of violence, right? And so not looking at death as punishment. But sometimes we do have to recognize that it's the ending of a chapter, maybe before I was ready for the chapter to come to an end. And this is why it's important for us to allow ourselves to be fully present in this grief process and all of the ebbs and flows that come along, because otherwise we'll get stuck. We'll get stuck in these ruminations and these thoughts that aren't accurate, but they're affecting our life in this very unhealthy way. And I understand that everybody's a little different, and some of you are like, oh, I can deal with it on my own. I don't want to be talking to other people. I don't like groups. But I encourage you that oftentimes grief, when you try to hold it close and keep it in, it becomes consuming. And so it's important for you to be able to find spaces and places where you can grieve in healthy ways. Because we can both honor a person's memory and recognize that we have limitations. We can both recognize that something was an accident and not necessarily the result of our negligence. We can absolutely have loved someone and been there for them, but they were in a dark place, and that darkness consumed them. And so they made a decision that they just could not take that pain anymore. And it isn't because they didn't feel loved, right? So there's these both ands as opposed to the either ors that I think come along with this grief process too, when you allow yourself to be in it, as uncomfortable as it is, and challenge some of these thoughts that we have in our survivor's guilt. And it's also important that we didn't necessarily cause somebody's pain. I know a lot of times we're like, oh, but we got in an argument, or we had a breakup and then they completed suicide. There was pain already underneath a lot of times before we even came in the picture. And so, tying it to this single, like, oh, well, this happened right before, that may be correlational, but it doesn't mean it's causational, which means like, yeah, that probably in the scheme of all of the things they were dealing with felt like one more painful thing, and that they didn't want to have to deal with more and more painful thing, but do know that pain was already there. And again, acceptance means that we don't get to determine how that person heals. We don't get to determine when and where that person heals. That's a part of their own journey. But I can appreciate their life, and I can appreciate my life in this mourning process. And so it's important for us to understand too that being joyful doesn't mean that they didn't matter. It is not honoring to a person to put your life on hold and be stuck in isolation and misery. That's just a form of self-deprecation, which leads to the cognitive beliefs that I need to punish myself because I should have been there or should have done something different. It's also important for us to understand that living is not punishment, just like dying wasn't their punishment, right? Like sometimes, again, these are the courses of, and that's why we don't get to know how things will turn out. It's just important that we live our moments to the fullest. So honor yourself by allowing yourself to grieve. And then once you've done that, then you can start the process of really being able to honor them. You may want to volunteer and give back as a way to celebrate their lives. You might want to share stories about them to keep their memories going, because people never truly die when we continue to talk about them. But you also might want to share some things that may help other people. Like, hey, this loved one was struggling with depression that they weren't getting treated for. This person was using substances to numb instead of addressing their mental illness in other ways. This person was looking for love, and they thought that love meant pain, and that when a person was abusive to them, that it really meant that they were loved, right? So we can provide education about, like, here's different ways to look at this. These are healthier ways. Here's support groups. Here's options. Because in sometimes doing those things, hey, we may support families who have lost a loved one due to combat, uh, violence, right? So there are a lot of different ways that we can honor people. There are a lot of different ways that we can love on other people, that we can have this shared experience without it me taking responsibility for it and feeling guilty and shamed about it, right? So free yourself from being trapped to a past that you cannot change by allowing yourself to grieve and heal so you can live a life that is reflective of the love you shared with this person. An intentional and unconditional love. Be well.